Summer's going out guns blazing, isn't it? High 80s in Pittsburgh. I'm in short sleeves and shorts. Hey, why not? Keep it going as long as we can here. This is Gike's Got Game on the River's Edge, found at riversedgepgh.com, also broadcasting on Facebook Live. I just read this long expose on Mark Zuckerberg and Facebook on the New Yorker this week. Our affiliations are not always perfect, right? But I got to hand it to the people at Facebook for all their mistakes and foibles over the years. They put together a pretty decent broadcasting platform there. And I'm willing to take full advantage as we are here at the River's Edge. But you can find our 24/7 stream audio at riversedgepgh.com. And we have the video on our website too. So there are some other options if you don't want to endorse in whatever way that you might consider that an endorsement. The boys over at Facebook. Coming up on this show, well, there's plenty to go in the three periods that comprise Gike's Got Game. I'm talking about Pittsburgh pro teams that are making or have already made history, and not always the good kind of history. That's the conflict, right? When you talk about being notable, being in the news, it's not necessarily a positive thing. But in the case of, well, at least one of the three teams I'll talk about, it is an unadulterated positive, what they are in the process of pulling off this year. In the case of another, it's half and half. And in the case of a third, it's mostly bad. And we'll get to all of that later on in this program. Back-to-back weeks in studio for yours truly. To what do you owe the pleasure? Maybe it's just the love of routine on my part, being back stateside after taking a trip to Europe a couple of weeks ago. It's great to get back into this flow of things and letting the joy of creativity pour out. And that's what this show is. It's creativity. That's what life is. It's creativity. I think we are created to create. And whether that's making new website bios for the RMU men's hockey team, like I spent much of my week doing, or producing an original broadcast like this one, or of a pro soccer match, which I will once again attempt to pull off tomorrow at Highmark Stadium. When the Riverhounds face the Indy 11, creativity is what powers all this. And well, thank you for indulging my creative Jones here every Friday from 10 to 11. Creativity is also what Tyler Zelenko is putting to use right now, my engineer and producer, as he attempts to make my ramblings palatable to a mass audience here at the River's Edge. And creativity is what inspired Brian Crawford just here in studio, getting set up for a live band or for a live podcast recording, or Sarah Kramer, the two co-owners of River's Edge. They're both obviously inspired by creativity to establish this station in the first place. So today, before I get into the topics that I wanted to address on this show, my message is this weekend, this month, this year, whatever, create something. Or you could realize that the boring job or the duty that you have before you is actually creative in ways you might not have previously considered. That always helps me whenever I'm doing something that seems tedious. Though there's always the alternative, doing nothing and not making use of your time here on this planet. So go out there and get it. That's my motivational speech. That's my Tony Robbins impression for today. In this program, in this space, at the historic Mr. Smalls Theater, is my weekly creation. Again, it's called Gike's Got Game. We're here on the River's Edge Radio Network, which has made Mr. Smalls Theater its home for the past year plus. We're high on the hill here in Millvale, Pennsylvania. So what's on the lesson planner for today? Well, I gave you a tease, but I want to dig into baseball in segment one here. And despite my assertion last week that baseball is in the background now that hockey training camps have begun, and of course many of you follow American football very closely, I do want to address the Pirates, though, who have once again made a push back toward being interesting late in this weird, wacky, yet indicative 2018 season. It feels like we've been looking toward 2019 for the entire year. That's why the Freudian slip from my side of it. But maybe we shouldn't. Maybe we should be celebrating this year for the Pirates, because after their sweep of the Sad Sack Royals at PNC Park this week, and with a week and a half to go, they are more likely to finish with a winning record than a losing record. And just 2 weeks ago, it was looking like the opposite. It was appearing to be another slink to the finish line, not a sprint to the finish line by the Pirates, which is a familiar theme from the 16 and the 17 season when they finished below 500 and well out of the playoff race. They're still 6 games out of the National League's second wild card as of this Friday morning as they prepare to host the Brewers in the final home series of the year. But they're also, as I mentioned, on pace to have a winning record at 77 and 74. And judging from all the negativity that I heard in the offseason regarding this team, I think that has probably outperformed expectations for many of you out there. I actually said 85 wins, so they're right on line with that. In fact, they'll have to pick it up a little bit. So hopefully that'll motivate them if they want to prove me right over the course of the final 10 or possibly 11 games, depending on whether, by some miracle, that final makeup game that's scheduled for October 1st against the Marlins is actually necessary. I don't think it will be, so the Pirates might only need 4 more wins out of their final 10 games in order to clinch that winning season. And I do believe they can do that, even though they go up against contending teams in the Cubs and the Brewers, as I mentioned, this weekend. If the Pirates do finish over 500, or if they finish with just 2 more wins, in fact, or 3 more wins, that would give them their 4th best season since 1992. I know that sounds pathetic, but hey, it's reality. And as we all know, we remember the streak, right? 20 consecutive losing years from 93 through 2012, and the very painful end of the 2012 season when they were above 500 by more than 10 games in mid to late August, and then still managed to put up a losing record. We don't take winning records for granted around here, or at least we shouldn't. And I know most folks have checked out. The team making the playoffs in 13 and 14 and 15 has made most of us, including myself, aim for higher goals and expect more and expect the postseason to be the goal, not just a winning record, which in the big scheme, does it really matter if you miss the playoffs and you're over 500 or you're under 500? Not really if you're competing for championships. But at the same time, things are different around here. And I don't think 2013, 2014, and 2015 have completely erased that mentality. Or that's the feeling I'm getting from a lot of you Pirates fans out there. That's the feeling that I have as well, and perhaps that biases me. But to see a Pirates team win more than it loses, that's still a novelty coming from my perspective. Maybe if you grew up in the 60s and 70s, you feel differently, but I did not have that luxury. I was not alive for the last Pirates World Series championship. I was born in 85, so my first memories of the Pirates are losing. I was not old enough or interested enough in sports at the time to appreciate the early 90s Buccos. So I came up with them being terrible, and with any kind of push toward 500, getting my antenna up. And I ask you, how do you feel? I don't know. Maybe you can give me a response on Facebook Live right now, and I'll do my best to answer those comments. Because there is as much good as there is bad about the 18 Pirates, no matter how they finish, even if they lose their final 10 in a row. I don't think that changes my perspective on what they are this season and what they might be in 2019 and 2020 and beyond. And maybe that's the biggest problem, that there is just as much good as bad. In one side of the argument, you could say, well, at least they're not the Royals losing 100 games, or at least they're not the Orioles looking like they're going to lose 110 plus and post the worst record in the history of that storied franchise, which goes back 100 plus years. Not necessarily in Baltimore, but you get the picture. It's tough to lose as many as the Orioles are this year. But that seems to be the trend now in baseball. Either go for it all or tank and get that high draft pick and pile up talent through the amateur draft system. The Pirates never really did that outside of 2010. They didn't totally drop off. They didn't go into the tank for multiple years. So I suppose one year they did, but not like the Astros did, not like the Cubs did. And both of those teams, of course, were paid off handsomely in World Series championships, Chicago in 2016 and the Astros just last year. So the Pirates are doing it the other way. Neil Huntington has always believed that you just keep putting yourself in position with at least a decent team, and one of those years or two of those years or maybe many of those years, you outperform your expectations and your true talent level, and you get to the playoffs. And I look to a team like the Oakland A's right now. Most of us thought they would be a team that wins in the 70s and maybe finish in last place for the 3rd straight year in the AL West. Well, they already have banked 90-plus wins at this stage, and they're a near lock to make the playoffs as a wild card, if not as a division winner, out in the AL West, where they have to contend with Houston, of course. But the A's have operated more like the Pirates have, where they get by on a shoestring, and we've debated those merits and whether that's necessary for the Pirates on this show in the past and in other places. I'm sure you've had that debate if you're a Pirates fan. But the reality for the A's is that they've done it that way, and they've made the playoffs more than the Pirates since, the turn of the century, if you want to go that way, under the direction of Billy Beane at the top of that front office. Everyone knows the story of Moneyball and the team that inspired the book and later the movie. But the Pirates have had less success with that approach. And perhaps now that approach is outdated with teams either, as I mentioned, going way low to try to rise up, or the super teams, the teams that have all the money like the Dodgers, now getting smart in addition to having all those funds at their disposal. So it's tougher now to try to hang around and maybe nick 90 wins in an odd year and go to the playoffs. It's still possible, as the A's are proving, but it's tough to say where the Pirates are going to go from now. And if I had to guess, I would say they probably stick to their current core of talent at the moment, because it has gotten them to a spot where they're going to win 80-some games, it appears, this season. And they could convince themselves, well, one or two players performing up, one or two players staying healthy, one or two players that you pick up in free agency that outperform their expectations, and suddenly you're in the playoffs, and then you have a puncher's chance, as they say, in the MLB postseason, which increasingly we discover is rather random. And with the proliferation of bullpens and starting pitchers not mattering as much as they used to in the postseason, it's even more random than ever. So just get in. Yeah, that's fine, but I still don't see where the Pirates are going to find that above average or, heaven forbid, star-level talent to get them over the top. It seems like, with the exception of maybe a guy like Jamison Taillon or even Trevor Williams, both of whom are in the top 10 in ERA in the National League, and both of whom have been pleasant surprises this year, I don't know where the star talent is. Felipe Vasquez at the back end of the bullpen, but he pitches, 80 innings a year. That's not going to make a huge impact, even though it can lock down those victories that you expect to get. So the prospects in the Pirates system don't really have that star-level ceiling. Now they can always surprise, right? And look only to the St. Louis Cardinals for a team that has continuously churned out good players from their minor league system, not necessarily stars, and they've been in the playoffs more often than not, and looking like they're going to get back into it this year with a new manager and maybe a little bit of a fresh energy in that dugout. That always helps too. But for right now, if the Pirates stick to their current management, it looks like they're going to try to continue to grind out 80-some wins and then hope for the 90-plus with most things going right. And is hope enough for you? It might be. For me as a fan, from that perspective, I think it's better to see a team like this as opposed to the 2010 Pirates, which I mentioned before. They won, 57 games, I think, lost 105. That's no fun. What the Orioles are doing this year to their fan base, you may lose fans for multiple years because of that. So it's easy to say, well, yeah, you just tank. That's the solution. That's the formula to win these days, and then you'll rise up. Well, number one, it's not guaranteed that you'll rise up and that you'll evaluate these amateur talents properly and that you'll have the ability to have the window fly open for contention. And number two, you might kill fans in the process. And the Pirates are still going through that situation where they're trying to get back people from my generation. I'm 33 and definitely younger, who just see the Pirates as this sad franchise that is not worthy of their support because they don't put forth the effort to try to win. And whether that's right or wrong, that's the perception, and that's the thing they have to overcome. And all that losing that we saw, that we continue to see into this decade after the 3-year run at the playoffs, that makes it difficult. So it's not just about what's best for the team on the field. It's also about marketing, and it's about that cheap advertising that comes from winning baseball games. So at the very least, even though the Pirates might not be in a position to field a super team in the near future, the one thing I can take from this year is that they are good enough to be an interesting team. They've gone up and down. They had the 11-game winning streak. Now they've won 5 in a row. They've had their slumps to counter that as well. But overall, I think you'd rather take a team that's showing some flashes of goodness, if not greatness, as opposed to the alternative, like we saw with the Royals in here this week. That's the end of the first period on Gike's Got Game. Let me know if you agree or disagree, whether you care at all if the Pirates finish with a winning record. Does that still matter to you? It still matters somewhat to me, and I think that's a feather in your cap as a franchise when you win more than you lose. They may not be any higher than 4th in the division when all things are said and done. In fact, it looks like that's their fate. But, better than dropping 100 games, or better than being the Cincinnati Reds, which don't appear to have any way out of their current malaise. I am Matt Gike, coming to you from the Mr. Smalls Theater, historic Mr. Smalls Theater in Millvale. Back in a moment to talk about a team that's making assuredly good history in 2018. More details after this break.
Hey, it's Mike Sasson. Guess what? You used to love us at 10. You're going to love us even more at 9. It's me. It's Alex. It's funniness. It's guests. It's all sorts of me yelling into microphones only 1 hour earlier. It's exactly what you need at 9 o'clock. It's like a shot of adrenaline. It's the Mike Sasson Show, now starting at 9 o'clock on Tuesday on the River's Edge, a new kind of radio.
If it's Friday, it's Gike's Got Game. Hello, I am Matt Gike. I am the Gike of Gike's Got Game here on the River's Edge. Tyler Zelenko's here on camera, too, if you're watching on riversedgepgh.com or on Facebook Live on my Facebook feed, Matt Gike Media. And there, I asked the question that I essentially asked in the first period of today's show. Do you care if the Pirates have a winning record? Is that better or worse than bottoming out, considering how some recent teams like the Astros and the Cubs have done it successfully? Alan Saunders, a frequent guest on this show, and now the owner of his own program over at Pittsburgh Sports Live, our friends there, putting together a video platform as well. Alan says the Pirates haven't been all that good at drafting and development. Yes, that is true. So maybe the tear-it-all-down approach isn't a good fit for their front office's skills. Perhaps you're right. Maybe they're better off looking for those bargains on the free agent market, looking to make trades. And I still like the Chris Archer trade for right now. Give it a full year after the consummation of it before you judge it. I'm going to go with that as of right now. And hey, Archer pitched well against the Royals the other night. So maybe it's on the Pirates to make the most of the value they have as opposed to try to generate it through the draft. Well, every team tries to do that, but as opposed to leaning on that as the primary way of team building. So perhaps, all that considered, the best way for them to succeed is to linger around 500 true talent level and then try to boost that up, whether it be market inefficiencies, whether it be like we saw when they made the playoffs, focusing on getting ground balls and putting together a pretty good infield defense. If that can work, then go for it. And they'll have to continue to try to find those solutions, though, outside the box if they're going to continue to spend less than $100 million a year on Major League payroll. Here's a comment from Richard Palagallo. Hope I pronounced that correctly. One of those two times, Richard. My only expectation or hope for the Pirates, says Richard, was to finish as winners this year. See if they can hold on to that for the rest of the season. Yeah, now 3 games over. As I mentioned, if they don't make up that last game against the Marlins, all they have to do is go 4-6. 3 against the Brewers, 4 against the Cubs. That'll make it tough, but then they finish the season, probably finish the season in Cincinnati in a couple of weekends, next weekend. In fact, thanks for all of you for tuning in today. Some really good response in terms of the raw viewership and also the comments. I appreciate the interaction, and that's always a part of the show every week. On to the second period now, and the Pirates could make history, as I said. It's probably going to be their 4th best season in 25 years, believe it or not. But there's a team across downtown, over on the south side, that's making some unadulterated, purely good history, and that's the Pittsburgh Riverhounds of the United Soccer League. They're essentially a lock, are the Hounds, to make the USL playoffs for the first time in 3 years, and possibly more significantly for building a fan base, for getting people excited about pro soccer in Pittsburgh. They're a pretty good bet right now to host a playoff game for the first time since 2004. Yes, they've made the playoffs occasionally over the last decade plus, but they haven't hosted a playoff game, a postseason contest, a winner-take-all situation since 2004. And get your head around that. A team that's been around for 2 decades hasn't done something like that in quite some time. And realize that it's not like the Pirates or the Penguins or the Steelers, where you can watch all their games on TV, or they're easily accessible on TV. As of right now, you can watch a few of the Riverhounds games on the local CW channel when they're on the road. Otherwise, you have to have the ESPN Plus streaming platform, and that's still not as proliferated as just turning on AT&T Sportsnet like you can for, well, especially the Pirates and the Penguins. And, well, network TV carries the Steelers playoff games when they do make it. So it is more about playing at home and getting a chance to get people in that stadium and exposed to the team. And the best way, I think, to sell a pro sport and to sell a team is to get people there still. Even in this day of social media, of streaming platforms, of accessibility no matter where you are, from here to Albania to Australia and back around the world, it's more about if you get someone there live, I believe that's the best way to sell it. And maybe that's not the case for American pro football these days, but still I think that is the case for baseball. definitely the case for hockey, which translates so much better to the real live experience. And I believe soccer's that way too, because of the 22 players on the pitch. And you can get an appreciation for formation that way, more so than you can watching on a various device screen. And also to be there in the flesh and experience the atmosphere of a soccer match when you have a supporters group like the Steel Army, and they do an awesome job in the Paul Child stand at Highmark Stadium each and every home game, and they'll be trying to do it again tomorrow night against Indy 11 and another key matchup against a possible playoff foe. But last week, Louisville City, the reigning champions of the USL, brought their supporters group in, so it was a dueling situation there with chants and screams and drums and various musical instruments, and then the smoke bombs for the Steel Army won out in the end as the Hounds came back with 2 late goals to tie it up. But details of the last week's match aside, just the atmosphere was incredible. And if you were there, I think that it's contagious, it's addictive, and you want to be back. You want to enjoy that and experience that again. And I still think this younger generation, even though they love social media and all this, all the new media innovations that we have, whether they be tied to sports or not, experiences still sell. And I think it's more the case now where you can, in some cases, show off to your friends, oh, I was at this Hounds match and we had a blast, and you can put it on Instagram, you can put it on Snapchat, you can put it on Twitter or Facebook. If you're one of the olds like me, you're still more about Twitter and Facebook than the other two that I mentioned. But neither here nor there. I believe getting a home playoff game and experiencing that and putting that out there for Riverhounds fans, some long-suffering, some newcomers to the bandwagon, and no judgment from this angle, of course. But to have that would really solidify 2018 as the season that the Hounds turn the corner. And it's been enjoyable for me to be part of this team's resurgence from the broadcast booth. I do the play-by-play on ESPN Plus, and occasionally, as I said, on the CW here in Pittsburgh. And you probably guessed it's more fun to call wins than losses. But this is one of the rare occasions when a marketing plan put out by a team, and you may recall back in the spring if you follow the squad, or even if you don't, New Era Unleashed was the slogan for 2018. And we all know that marketing slogans are a dicey business in sports because you don't know what's going to happen. It's less of a sure thing than if you're putting out a new iPhone or whatever. But New Era Unleashed actually really describes 2018 for the Riverhounds. It actually lined up with what happened on the field. And as I was discussing with the Riverhounds media relations manager, Anthony Meyer, a couple of weeks ago when I took in a practice down there at Highmark Stadium, you treasure these moments when marketing lines up with reality in sports. And much of that new reality for the Riverhounds is due to the change in leadership with revered USL coach Bob Lilly taking over the team's soccer operations in the offseason after his old team in Rochester, the Rhinos, went on hiatus. No doubt the Hounds were fortunate that Lilly was available, but they also had the foresight, led by the owner, Tuffy Schallenberger, to realize that hiring Lilly, signing him on, and bringing his presence to the team would be transformative, or it was a good bet to be transformative. And so, with almost an entirely new team, there's just a handful of returners from 2016 and 17 for Pittsburgh, and why retain players from a team that didn't succeed. But at this level, most contracts are 1 or 2 years, so the Riverhounds had the ability, with Lilly at the helm, playing general manager here, to go out and find players that either he had experience with before, playing his swarming defensive system, or scout and find new guys like potential USL Rookie of the Year Thomas Vankiaziel from tiny University of Charleston, West Virginia, my home state. But they've produced some pretty good soccer talent over the years, including Rob Vincent, one of the Hounds' all-time leading scorers, who went on to DC United, you might recall, a couple of years ago. So the personnel completely turned over, almost completely turned over, just a few returnees. And surprise, surprise, with the new coaching, with the new personnel, the Riverhounds have looked like an entirely new team. They've succeeded by defending, as I mentioned. That's Lilly's trademark. His team in Rochester in 2015 set the all-time league record for fewest goals allowed per game. And this year's Hounds are challenging that, or at least they were until the last couple of weeks when they gave up a few goals. But still, they're the top defensive team in the league. That's what they base their approach on. That's what they base their success on. But I think they've also shown enough flash at the attacking end, and it's not all about shutting it down and parking the bus for the Hounds. If you've watched the games, you realize they're committed to the counterattack, and particularly at home, they're committed to high pressure on the ball, forcing turnovers. And I think it's enjoyable to watch when they don't have the ball just as much as it is when they do. So that's allowed Hounds fans, and broadcaster in this case, to dream about an extended playoff run this year and maybe even a multi-year title window. I suppose we'll see how things go. Like I said, there's a lot of turnover in this league from year to year, but as we've seen with a team like Louisville that came in last Saturday, they've been able to retain plenty of players from their championship teams, from their teams that have finished in the top 2 in the Eastern Conference all 4 years that they've been active as a franchise. And all of this, all the details add up to a team that's rising at the perfect time, as the USL, currently the second-tier league in the United States. If you're familiar with Major League Soccer, the USL is one tier below it. The USL outlasted the, well, I don't know whether to call it the defunct or on hiatus North American Soccer League, which had some of its teams poached by the USL. And really, U.S. soccer biased itself towards the USL. They wanted the USL to be the second division team. So because of the way that soccer is here in this country compared to elsewhere, where it's more of a meritocracy and you can rise and fall based on performance, this is more like the hard and fast major league and minor league scenario that you see in baseball and to some degree hockey. So it's more familiar for U.S. sports fans, but not necessarily for world soccer fans. But at any rate, the USL was preferred by U.S. soccer, and the Riverhounds were fortunate to find themselves already in that league, and they were also fortunate and in a lot of ways prescient to try to peak this season and go out and get Bob Lilly to go out and spend the money. So credit to Tuffy Schallenberger for doing that, committing funds to the team, to facility upgrades at Highmark Stadium, now 5 years old. It's the perfect time to do that because now the Hounds look like a team that the USL can be proud to have in its ranks and do not appear to be a candidate anytime soon to drop down to the new Division III league that the USL is establishing. So the Hounds have already seen their longtime league brethren in Richmond, the Kickers, and Rochester, the Rhinos, commit to dropping down to that new D3 league. So the old guard status doesn't do much when you're trying to keep up with the Joneses now in the USL, which is a nationwide league which is trying to raise its level, both of play and of financial might, to put it bluntly. So, because they've dished out the funds and because they've gotten better on the field, the Riverhounds have risen not a moment too soon. And their hard-earned spot in the Division II USL could very well have been in jeopardy, I think, if they had continued to flounder, if they had finished out of the playoffs and looked like a team that didn't have any real direction. As it is, they're now looking like one of the elites in the USL. And like I said, a team that this league can be proud to have under its umbrella. And that's huge. I don't have to say that, but I will. That's huge for local soccer fans and those of us around here who harbor Major League Soccer dreams at some point. No, it's not coming anytime soon. They are not going to go MLS in the next few years. It's just not happening. You need several things to occur. You need a bigger facility. You need a huge influx of money in order to go MLS. And you also have to ingratiate yourselves with the cabal that is Major League Soccer. It's a single ownership group, if you will. You don't really own a franchise in MLS. You buy into the league. So it's different from most sports leagues. It's different from the USL too. So not to talk about that too much. I don't want to because I feel it's unrealistic at this point. But at some juncture down the line, if the Riverhounds do feel themselves in a position to make that final jump and to put themselves in the major leagues, in the world of soccer, it's much better to be in the USL than it would be to drop down to D3. So a well-timed surge for the Hounds, and just in terms of the fun of watching a winning team, I'm looking forward to what they can do in the playoffs. They can actually clinch a playoff spot this weekend, and if they finish in the top 4 in the East, right now they're third and in a pretty good spot, they will host a playoff game, and I think they have a pretty good home advantage. They've only lost twice all year at Highmark Stadium in 15 matches. So looking forward to how this season concludes, and you can watch the Hounds on ESPN Plus and listen to my dulcet tones alongside Pittsburgh soccer legends Gene Klein and Paul Child. We'll be back at it, Paul and Gene and I, on Saturday, tomorrow, at 7 o'clock against Indy 11. Back for the third period, we'll switch brands of football from world football to American football. I know I said I'm not going to watch football this season, but some part of this early NFL slate has gotten my attention. And no, it's not the Browns winning, although that was interesting, apparently, last night, as I found out this morning. The Browns are victorious, but that's not the type of history I want to talk about as we conclude. Gike's Got Game on the other side of this break. If you know me, it's a little more weird, and that fits with my personality, a little more unique than just wins and losses. Quite literally, it's more unique than wins and losses. If you don't know what I'm talking about, I'll fill you in when we come back on the River's Edge.
You didn't wash your hands! People who do not wash their hands should be fined. And I'm sorry, I don't know about all of you, but if you're gonna castrate me, you might as well just kill me! So enjoy your hot dog, you jackass!
Get educated with Brian Crawford live Monday, Wednesdays, and Fridays at 10 a.m. here on the River's Edge.
And we return on the River's Edge, doing some housekeeping from the second period here via Facebook Live. Our frequent guest and friend Jared Wickerham asked, how do the playoffs work in the United Soccer League? I was discussing the Hounds and how they've essentially locked up a playoff spot and trying to make their own history as they, well, pretty much have already at this point, being in such a good position and having such a spectacular points percentage at this stage of the year. But, of course, the playoffs are coming up. What happens is, out of the two conferences, East and West, the top 8 teams make the playoffs. In fact, it's just like the NHL or the NBA in that way, and just like those leagues, the home team gets advantage. I'm not sure if they reseed, actually. That's the one part that I don't know. The NHL does, the NBA doesn't. In the NBA, it's more of a true bracket scenario, where the bracket is the bracket, and it doesn't change. In the NHL, the NHL used to do this. Now they don't with the divisional playoffs, so I misspoke there. But I'm not certain if the USL does that, where the highest available seed after one round, for instance, plays the lowest available seed. So I'll have to look into that. Can you blame me for not knowing, because the Riverhounds haven't been in the playoffs in 3 years? And, I haven't looked into it in that way because they have not advanced in the playoffs in quite some time, as I said. But, yes, top 8 make it, 4 rounds of playoffs, including the USL Cup final when East meets West. And Jared also quips, will we be talking about Stormy Daniels' new book and her comments about Big Ben? No, we will not, although if you want to find out about those sorts of things, you can go online and discover a season of drama for the Steelers, no doubt about it. If you thought that last season was dramatic and there were various scenarios that popped up during the course of 17 weeks plus playoffs that you never would expect, maybe this season has topped it. And I mentioned, was it last week? I think it was, that I was abstaining from football this year. I wanted to eliminate it from my sports diet. And so far, so good. Through 2 weeks, I have not watched a single play of any college or professional American football game. And so I can't break down the Steelers' secondary problems against Pat Mahomes. I think that was his name, something Mahomes, of the Chiefs last week, or their disappointing tie with the Browns, who suddenly are ahead of the Steelers in the AFC North standings. I do check on the news. I'm just not watching the games, to be clear, and I'm not involving myself too much in discussion about the games and the dramas. And so we'll be leaving Antonio Brown and Big Ben and Stormy Daniels by the wayside in this final period of Gike's Got Game for this week, in lieu of something weirder, stranger. As Roger Sherman of TheRinger.com so eloquently stated earlier this week, the NFL is in the midst of a tie epidemic. Yes, ties are back in football. And whether you call it a tie or a draw or whatever, I find them very interesting. That's my perspective here. Maybe it's just the rarity of it. And if there were several ties every week, I would get tired of it, or, well, certainly the novelty would wear off. And novelty is, a lot of cases, defining when it comes to figuring out what's news and what's not. So I don't want to be hypocritical here and say that I love ties unconditionally. And I do recall back in the pre-full season lockout days in the NHL when ties were just a part of hockey. I don't know if I was entirely thrilled by it. It was definitely more exciting to see a team win in regular season overtime compared to the alternative if you had no dog in the fight. Now, there were times when your team would come back and get a good tie. The Penguins did that a few times that I can recall back in that era, more than a few times. And there were also bad ties, too. There were ties that felt like losses because you felt like your team should have picked up the win. And hey, speaking of soccer and the Riverhounds, last week was a stereotypical good tie because they were down 2-0 with 5 minutes to play and scored twice in those final 5 to pull out a point. And maybe in soccer it's not as huge as it was in hockey because you got 2 for a win in hockey, and you still do, and you got 1 for a tie. In soccer, you get 3 for a win. So the win is still valued higher in soccer, and I love that about soccer in that way. But to at least give some reward for being even through regulation time, I think is a feature, not a bug. And I've seen so many people on social media, on television, on the radio say, well, we shouldn't have ties. There should be a winner. There should be a decision made. Well, for me, a tie is a decision. These two teams were even on that day, and they didn't deserve to see a winner and a loser, or at least in terms of the scoreboard, they didn't deserve that. So we didn't have to artificially generate some scenario like the NHL does with its shootout to create a winner and a loser. And I would be perfectly happy if the NHL went with 3 points in the standings for a win, 2 for an overtime win, and 1 for a tie. I would not mind that in the least, but I don't know if they want to do that. I don't know if there's any desire to do that. And as always, the NHL, it takes some serious movement to create change. And I think right now the owners and the teams like it because they can stay in these races longer, or at least it feels like they can. Studies have shown that it's more artificial parity, that even if you boosted it up to 3 points for a win and did that, and didn't count overtime victories the same as regular season or regulation victories, I should say, it still doesn't create that separation in the standings that people like myself would like to see. But I still feel like it's good to reward that sort of thing toward not playing for overtime. The NFL, of course, has a different situation. We've seen barely any ties in this league for years. And as Roger Sherman wrote on The Ringer, different overtime rules recently have led to increased amount of ties. You'll recall just a couple of years ago, the NFL changed its rules where you couldn't win with a field goal on the first possession of overtime. That was a way to ostensibly not decide games based on a coin flip, because it did feel like, I think more often than not, the team that got the ball first at least could get a field goal. So then the NFL said, all right, we'll still play 15 minutes in overtime in the regular season and in the playoffs, but you have to win with a touchdown on the first possession. Otherwise, if the first possession passes, then it's sudden death, essentially. So pretty contrived, right? Well, now it still is like that. You can't win on the first possession with a field goal, and overtime has been cut from 15 minutes to 10 minutes. I'm all in favor of less football being played in general because of the deleterious effects it has on players' long-term health. But you had to know that it was going to lead to more ties. And we've seen, lo and behold, in the first 2 weeks of the NFL season, not that I've watched them, but we've seen this. I know that it's happened. Steelers and Browns, of course, how could you avoid that news around here? Tied up 21 apiece in week 1. And just last week, the Packers and the Vikings, 2 other division rivals, tying 29-29, which, by the way, was the first ever 29-29 score in the history of the NFL. Overtime's been a part of the NFL for more than 40 years now. It dates back to the late 60s, I believe. So we're used to not seeing ties in football, but ties in football used to be a big thing. You'll recall a lot of cases, it was in college football even, which now doesn't allow ties at all. You're going to play forever if you continue to trade scores in that contrived scenario that they have. It's fun to watch, I would admit, but it's not at all like the rest of the game, kind of like the NHL shootout. But remember, college ties used to be a big deal. Teams would play for the tie in some situations. The phrase unbeaten and untied, that was created for college football back in the day. They didn't even play overtime. They played 60 minutes and that was it. If you were tied, too bad. Then you were going to split the decision in that way. And for me, if there is a sport out there that deserves or should have ties, for many reasons, it's actually football. Because, number one, it's a brutal enough of a game. You don't have to tack on 15 extra minutes in the extreme version of overtime. Or in the case of college football, you don't have to add all these extra collisions. I think to minimize all that stuff, and we've seen that in practices, right? Teams can't hit as much, especially in the NFL, as they used to in practice. We could argue whether that makes it a better game during the actual play, but I think it's a worthy move to try to decrease the amount of contact that is made during the week leading up to the games. And the same type of a reasoning applies for me for the games themselves and as it pertains to overtime. But so there's the player safety aspect, but also I think from the fairness aspect of it, these games are already part of a very small sample size. In college football, it's 12, 14 games you play at the most, 14. In the NFL, it's 16 to determine who makes the playoffs, who gets higher seeds, and in a lot of cases, who gets buys to the second round. So these are important results. And unlike in baseball with 162, unlike in hockey or basketball with 82 games, one or two bounces could actually determine your season in the NFL. And don't get me started when it comes to turnovers and fumbles and how random that is and how we shouldn't assign much meaning to that type of a scenario. But the point stands that one or two moments can decide a year. And that's okay in the playoffs. But in the regular season, when we're trying to figure out who the better teams are, I think we should allow for ties more because it doesn't create that artificial certainty that, oh, yeah, definitely, the Steelers were better than the Browns in week one or the Browns were better than the Steelers because they got a field goal at the end of regulation or at the end of overtime, and that's why they were better, even though they played 70-plus minutes even up. For me, I'd rather just say, okay, it was a tie, and value more those situations where a team can win in regulation. So in a lot of ways, the tie just eliminates that game and says they were even. We knock it off the schedule, not entirely because it still gets listed and it still affects winning percentage. But overall, it puts more emphasis on the games that you win or you lose in regulation, which in theory would give us a better idea of who the better teams are and who the worst teams are in the regular season, which, again, in theory, is the point of the regular season, right? So in two ways, at least, I think football should have ties. And also, like I said, there is the novelty effect. There is the effect of adding more nuance to the discussion, too. I know everyone hates nuance in the NFL. It's you play once a week, you win or you lose, and you bitch about it all week if you lose, you celebrate it all week if you win. But that gets tiresome for someone like me who realizes that life, let alone sports, is not black and white. And the introduction of nuance, actually, I think is better for discussion. I think it's better for my brethren in sports talk radio because you can interpret it different ways. And well, if you did listen to sports talk radio after the Steelers and Browns tied in week one, I bet you had people say, well, this and that was good about it, this and that was bad about it. Maybe it's a bad example because the Browns are expected to stink as always, and Pittsburgh is expected to compete for a Super Bowl. But under more normalized circumstances, it's up for interpretation. Maybe for the Steelers, it felt like a loss because they blew a lead. But there it is again. You can paint it your own way, and you can interpret it in whatever fashion that you want. And doesn't that make for better discussion, right? It's not necessarily black and white. It gives you some room to paint in shades of gray. And I also enjoyed Ed Bouchette of the Pittsburgh Post-Gazette. He had a column last week on ties and how they would actually lead to more clarity late in the season. You know what I hate in the NFL late in the year, too, is that we have to talk about all these tiebreakers because you play so few games, so you're going to have teams finish with the same record. It's just a matter of how many in a given year. So instead of going to the first tiebreaker or the second tiebreaker or the third, you can just say, okay, the Steelers went 10-5-1, just a scenario here, and the Browns went 10-6. Well, the Steelers, or not the Browns, but it would be a different team. The Bengals went 10-6. Well, the Steelers have a slightly better winning percentage because they went 10-5 in games that were decided as opposed to that 6th loss that the Bengals had. So you say, all right, you reward the Steelers for the tie there, and they get the tiebreaker, if you will, in that scenario. You don't have to go down chapter and verse. Well, how many points did they give up in this game? How they do in their division? How they do in their conference? How they do in similar games between opponents or shared opponents between teams that are tied. You don't have to do all that. A tie can actually create some extra separation at the end of the year. So there you go, yet another reason why ties are good, and I'm not backing down on that stance. Ironically, even though I say there is no black and white, I believe ties are good for football for a myriad of reasons. What do you think? Do you have any thoughts? Let me know on Facebook after the fact. This post will be live, in fact, on my Matt Gike Media page, and we can continue the discussion there. I think, even though in hockey, like I said, I didn't mind the tie era, I'd be okay as long as they awarded more points for a regulation win as opposed to an overtime or a shootout win. And in soccer, for me, it's pretty darn good. It's you either win in regulation when it's not a cup or a tournament scenario, or you go home with a tie. And it just seems more right on certain nights. There are some nights, there are some games that neither team deserves to win. There are some games that neither team deserves to lose, if you want to angle it that way. And so it gives that option. We're not artificially generating this separation here. So that's what I think. Again, I'm leaving it open to discussion because, as I just said, I love having discussion. I love having the talks about nuance in sports and leaving the door open for all sorts of perspectives and not having to go to, well, the Steelers deserve to win because they got the field goal with 1 second left in overtime, even though if you watch that game, from what I understand, it was not the greatest display of football by a team wearing black and gold. So that's that for this week's Gike's Got Game. Wrapping it up. Gike's Got Game, sometimes it's a tie. Sometimes I win. Sometimes you win. Sometimes the debate is up for grabs. So we'll continue on that path. And before I sign off, hey, congratulations to the Browns. They wore brown at home, first of all. No coincidence. They actually won wearing the color in their team name. That's a pet peeve for a different time and a different scenario on this show. But I'm not so anti-Cleveland that I will hold back my enthusiasm for a team winning, for a fan base experiencing a victory for the first time in a year and a half. And as I said, when they celebrated 0-16 and they poked fun at themselves, they deserved a moment like what they got last night against the New York Jets. So tip of the cap to Cleveland, and then we can all go back to hating your guts in all sports, at least. Well, football might be the primary one, but someday maybe there will be a Turnpike series between the Pirates and the Indians. And hockey, while we're still waiting on Cleveland getting a franchise there. Thanks so much for tuning in. I am Matt Gike. Tyler Zelenko has been alongside producing, and the show couldn't go on without you, of course, the loyal viewers and listeners. This is Matt reminding you that when the radio fades, you know life's moving fast. God bless. Have a great weekend, and I'll talk to you tomorrow. Or not tomorrow. I'll talk to you next week. Same time, same place.